At 0923 hours on June 14, 2025, the USS Princeton was conducting another routine freedom of navigation patrol in the South China Sea when her spy radar painted something that would nearly start World War II. A Chinese Type 052D destroyer that had been loitering at 200 km just as she suddenly accelerated from 18 to 30 knots in under 90 seconds. Unknown to the Americans, the John Chang's captain had just received orders from Beijing. Intercept the Americans and make them blink first. But Beijing was about to learn why challenging the U.S. Navy in open water remains a spectacularly stupid idea. The NIMS carrier strike group you see here had been doing what American sailors have done best for 75 years, keeping the world's most important sea lanes open so Chinese factories could sell their cheap electronics to Best Buy. They were 180 nautical miles from the nearest Chinese territory in international waters where $3.4 trillion in annual trade flows like clockwork. The strike group's mission was textbook freedom of navigation, predictable course, transparent intentions, and the kind of professional conduct that separates real navies from floating militia. At 0926, the target classification was complete. The radar operators had positively identified a Type 052D destroyer of the Chinese Navy, with a threat assessment of moderate to high. Inside the Princeton's Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer watched the Chinese destroyers vector with the calm that comes from having 122 vertical launch cells loaded with enough firepower to turn any Chinese ship into fish food. The spy radar, the world's most advanced naval sensor, painted a picture so clear you could point out every detail of the enemy ship. At the Chinese destroyers' current speed, he'd reach weapons engagement range in exactly 17 minutes. The math was simple but terrifying for the Chinese. Her YJ-18 anti-ship missiles could cover the remaining distance in under 4 minutes once launched, but the Princeton's SM-6S in surface mode could reach about 240 nautical miles and swat them like flies. At 0929, the captain wanted to know the probable intent of the Chinese ship. The answer was obvious. At current speed and heading, she'd be within weapons release range in 14 minutes. The recommendation was to go to general quarters. But the captain's response was pure American confidence. Let's see how badly they want to embarrass themselves first. That's even if they could get there safely. The South China Sea was packed with merchant traffic, 46 commercial vessels within 50 miles, all depending on the U.S. Navy's presence to guarantee safe passage. A Singapore flag container ship loaded with semiconductors, a South Korean LNG tanker worth $200 million. All would be at risk if Beijing succeeded in turning international waters into its personal swimming pool. But that would require them to actually win a fight against the U.S. Navy, which hasn't happened since never. At 0930, the Princeton's cooperative engagement capability automatically shared the threat data across every ship in the strike group. The NIMS herself, 104,600 tons of floating American diplomacy, carrying 90 of the world's most advanced aircraft, adjusted her flight operations with the precision of a Swiss watch. The destroyers Chung Hun and Kidd shifted positions to take station around the carrier that would turn any Chinese attack into a one-way trip to the bottom. At 0935, the tactical picture went from concerning to dangerous. The E-2D Hawkeye orbiting at 25,000 feet, providing a god's view of everything. Within 400 m detected multiple aircraft launching from the Chinese carrier Shandong. The radar signatures were consistent with those of J-15 fighters, climbing hard and heading south as if they actually stood a chance. The air controllers immediately noticed something hilarious. The J-15s were struggling to gain altitude, likely due to fuel limitations from the ski jump launch system the Chinese were so proud of. A minute later, the sonar operators added the final piece of China's coordination puzzle. They detected a possible submerged contact 80 nautical miles away, an acoustic signature consistent with a Type 039 diesel electric submarine. The funny part, the thing was making noise like a freight train. Any competent submarine crew would have been mortified. The Chinese weren't just being aggressive. They were orchestrating a multi-domain intimidation campaign with equipment that belonged in a museum. Surface ships from the 1990s, carrier aircraft that couldn't carry a full weapons load, and submarines so loud they might as well be broadcasting their position on AM radio. It was textbook bullying, the kind that only works if your target is too weak or too scared to fight back. Unfortunately, for Beijing, they just challenged the wrong Navy in the wrong ocean. The U.S. Navy had been perfecting blue water dominance since 1914, and these Chinese forces were about to receive a free lesson in why the American Navy reigned supreme. By 0937, the USS Nymph's flight deck erupted into controlled chaos that only American carriers have truly mastered. FA-18E Super Hornets from BFA-14 top hatters rocketed off the catapults at 45-second intervals, a ballet of precision that Chinese carriers depended on inefficient ski jumps could only dream of matching. Steam billowed from the catapult tracks as American naval aviation did what it does best: project power. The 1st Division of Super Hornets climbed through 15,000 feet, their ANAPC 79 ASA radars already painting the incoming J-15S at maximum range. The technological mismatch was almost unfair. The APG-79's 00 transmit-receive modules could track dozens of targets simultaneously, while the J-15's mechanically scanned radar swept back and forth like a lighthouse, broadcasting its position to anyone listening. The J-15s were struggling for altitude, a painful reminder of the Shandong ski jump limitations. Without catapults, they launched with reduced fuel and weapons loads. They were climbing hard to gain an energy advantage, but burning fuel at a faster rate. Meanwhile, the American fighters, launched at full combat weight, had fuel to spare and carried hands rated E4. Everyone, however, the weapon and fuel loadout was just the advantage the Chinese could physically see. Every F-18 was connected via Link 16, sharing sensor data in real time. When one aircraft saw something, they all saw it. Chinese pilots, meanwhile, relied on voice commands and individual sensors, like fighting a network team while blindfolded. The technological gap wasn't measured in years but decades. The E-18G Growlers entered the fight without firing a shot. These electronic warfare variants carried ALQ-9 jamming pods that could fry enemy electronics from 100 miles away. As they established their jamming orbits, Chinese communications began to fragment. On Chinese radar screens, ghost contacts multiplied. American fighters appeared and disappeared, multiplied and merged. What looked like for F-18s became 12, then 20. Radar locks broke and reformed constantly. The J-15 pilots found themselves fighting phantoms while real threats maneuvered unseen. The Americans executed a tactical spread called the Wall, a defensive formation perfected over decades. A high cab at 35,000 feet, medium at 25,000, and low at 15,000. Multiple overlapping engagement zones, mutual support, and nowhere for the Chinese to go without entering someone's weapons. Envelope. The Americans had the Chinese in a vice 3 times over. The Chinese formation, by contrast, remained bunched, a necessity when your data links can't support distributed operations. They had to maintain visual contact to coordinate, making them predictable and vulnerable. Their J-15s might look impressive on propaganda posters, but in actual combat they were flying antiques against 21st century warfare. At 0943, the RC-135B rivet joint provided crucial intelligence. This ungainly Boeing 707 derivative had been boring holes in the sky for 6 hours. Its electronic intelligence equipment cataloging every Chinese emission. The Mandarin linguists aboard were having a field day. Dark Star confirms Chinese pilots requesting permission for aggressive maneuvers. Repeat, they're asking for clearance to buzz our ships. The Chinese were escalating, but asking permission first. American pilots trained to seize initiative found this pretty funny. By the time Beijing approved anything, the tactical situation would have changed 3 times over. Meanwhile, the Princeton's defense systems tracked every threat with mechanical precision. Her spy radar, capable of tracking objects the size of a baseball at over 165 miles, made the Chinese destroyer look like a barn door. Fire control solutions were updated continuously, and soon it seemed like they might actually come in handy. At 0947 hours, the Jiangnan crossed a line that would have triggered immediate retaliation from any other Navy. Her Type 346A phased array radar stopped searching and locked onto the USS Nimitz with fire control quality tracking. In naval warfare, this is one breath away from launching missiles, the electromagnetic equivalent of pointing a loaded gun at someone. Inside Princeton CIC, the response was immediate but measured. American discipline drilled through countless exercises held firm. The Chinese were betting American restraint against their aggression. They were about to learn that restraint didn't mean inability. The Princeton's own fire control radars remained in standby. Her 122 vertical launch cells contained enough firepower to send the John Chong to the bottom in seconds. SM-6 missiles that could reach out 240 kilometers and SM-2S in surface mode, all ready to turn the ship into the area's newest artificial reef. Every firing solution is continuously updated. The Chinese destroyer was at risk from multiple systems from multiple angles with zero chance of survival if this situation escalated. The fire control lock persisted for exactly 30 seconds long, enough to claim they could have attacked, not long enough to trigger American self-defense measures. It was choreographed aggression, but against the wrong opponent. The Princeton's crew documented everything: timestamps, signal characteristics, and bearing data, information that would be quite useful in a real shooting war. But despite the Chinese ship stopping its illumination, things were far from over. In the air, a J-15 pilot decided to demonstrate his own recklessness. Breaking from formation, he dove toward an F-18 with what fighter pilots call a thump, an aggressive close pass meant to intimidate. The American pilot trained at Top Gun, where such maneuvers are eaten for breakfast, simply rolled, inverted, and pulled into the Chinese fighter's 6 o'clock position. For 3 seconds, the American had a perfect firing solution. His helmet-mounted display showed the Chinese fighter engines glowing hot in infrared. One squeeze of the trigger would send an AIM-9X side winder straight up the J-15's tailpipe. He didn't squeeze. Professional discipline held. The moment passed, but the Chinese still had one trick up their sleeve. The Chinese escalation reached its peak when the submarine made its move. The Type 039 diesel-electric boat had been creeping closer, using the layered depth to mask its approach. At 0951, it made a critical error, raising its snorkel to recharge batteries. TO. Sonar subsurface contact, bearing 159. Range 15,000 yards. Contact is snorkeling. Classified as probable Type 039. He's making noise like a freight train. The submarine captain either didn't know or didn't care that the Princeton's SQ-89 sonar suite had been tracking him for the past hour. The ship had its acoustic signature catalog, its position fixed to within meters. If this went kinetic, he'd have about 12 seconds to contemplate his life choices before him. Azrock turned his boat into fish food. The tactical picture had become a textbook study on how not to conduct naval operations. Chinese forces had positioned themselves in a box carrier. To the northwest, a destroyer to the west, and a submarine to the southwest. If shooting started, none of them would survive the first 5 minutes. And the Americans were about to show them exactly how that would go down. At 14:30 hours, the USS Nimitz launched everything that could fly. 48 aircraft roared off her deck in the largest single carrier display of air power in years. Super Hornets loaded with live weapons. EA-18G Growlers carrying electronic warfare packages that could black out a city. E-2D Hawkeyes commanding the electric high ground. The afternoon sky turned dark with American aircraft. The Growlers went to work. First, their Yelq-99 pods operating at full power turned Chinese radar screens into modern art. False contacts appeared by the hundreds. Real aircraft vanished into electronic noise. The Shandong's air defense picture looked like someone had thrown paint at the screens. Chinese controllers couldn't distinguish real threats from ghosts. Everything was a threat. Then came the submarine, a Virginia-class attack submarine that had been shadowing the Chinese formation for 8 days. Silent, invisible, patient. At 1547, she surfaced 6 nautical miles from the Shandong, close enough for Chinese lookouts to see her black hole with their Mark I eyeballs. The psychological impact was devastating. 8 days of undetected operations. Their entire anti-submarine screen, helicopters, sonobuoys, and hull-mounted sonar had failed to detect the 7,900-ton American submarine. If this had been war, their carrier would already be toast. The sub's commanding officer ordered an emergency surface purely for effect. The submarine burst from the water like a breaching whale, water cascading off her hull in the afternoon sun. Photographers on the Chinese ships would have perfect shots of American dominance. After about 90 seconds, enough time to be seen, photographed, and reported, she slid back beneath the waves. The message was clear. We own the undersea domain. Back in the air, American fighters demonstrated ACM, air combat, maneuvering at the expense of increasingly desperate Chinese fighters. The J-15S, already low on fuel from their ski jump launches and hard climb to altitude, found themselves unable to match the Americans turn for turn. Each engagement ended the same way. American fighters in firing position, Chinese fighters defensive and burning precious fuel. One by one, the Chinese fighters peeled off, heading back to the Shandong with near-empty tanks. Their combat endurance had been exhausted in fruitless attempts to match American capabilities. They landed with emergency fuel. Some probably saw the bingo light they'd only seen in simulators before. By 1623, the Shandong's carrier strike group began its withdrawal. Official Chinese communications spoke of completing scheduled exercises, but Everyone knew the truth. They'd come to demonstrate Chinese naval power, to intimidate lawful navigation, to claim waters that didn't belong to them. Instead, they'd received a lesson in why the South China Sea is America's sixth Great Lake. Bye for now.